Two guys presenting about presenting, and we're gonna use no visuals today, but we're gonna talk about visuals. Actually, that's not true. I have one visual I want to show, and maybe we'll kick it off with the one visual because I think it kind of captures what we're going to be talking about, and that's this concept that people actually can't process your visual and listen to you at the same time. Mm-hmm. So
I
made this with a friend.
I was just going to say, like, multitasking is a myth. We are not actually able to pay equal attention to two things at the same time, neurologically speaking. I am told.
Yeah, multitasking is a total myth. I mean, you can breathe and talk, but once you get much beyond breathing, then any sort of complex task.
Right. Because
there's only one language processor. So anything to do with language. Mark, you've had this experience. We've all had this experience, right? You're in a coffee shop and you're reading. I got my book. And I start listening to the conversation. Always listen to the other conversation, right? We're not supposed to, right?
It's hard not to.
And you turn the page, and then you turn the next page, and then they leave, and you're like, how many pages do I have to go backwards? Because you literally none of the information you were reading got to your brain. And the inverse happens with slides. People start reading your slides and they stop listening to you talk because they only have one language processor, and we're competing with ourselves.
Right, exactly. And, that's now we'd sort of talk tactically for a minute here. So one thing that I started doing a little while back after reading some research on the topic was, if you think about the bullet points on a slide, you could just advance the slide and see the 4 bullet points all at once. Basically you're not giving your reader any guidance on where the reader should pay attention among those 4 points. Or you could just show one bullet point at a time and then click. So you're basically like, whatever, it doesn't have to be a fancy effect. I usually use dissolve, right? So the slide goes up, it could be blank. I click, the first bullet point goes up, and I talk to the first bullet point. So there's no other option. There's no other competitor for the
people aren't reading ahead.
Right. They're not reading ahead. There's nothing to read ahead. Then I click the next one when I'm ready for that. It doesn't get to this question of image, the visual that could accompany that, though, Andy, but we can talk, obviously we're going to talk about that some more, but just something to think about when you're talking about, like, what do you want your listener to visualize and when? And, like you were saying,
I love that question of when. One of the things we can talk about too is the difference between online and in person. Before we get there, welcome everyone. If you're listening live, please drop a comment in the chat to us, so that we know you're there. And if you have questions or you have things you want to trigger in our conversation, just type them in the message, and they'll pop up, and you'll guide our conversation. Otherwise, you never know where we're going to go. Online versus in person. So when we're in person and we animate, of course, that movement draws attention away from us, right? Slide moves. I'm looking at you, Mark, and then something happens on the slide, and even if you and I are eye contact, I want to go see what happened. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the downsides of that animation, but the upside is people can't read ahead.
And the thing
it's a balancing act, right? How do we make that decision?
I'm going to be talking about that bullet point. So these points are really short.
Yeah.
It won't take long for you to look, and I'm going to reference. I may even point to it
Yeah.
as it goes up, but it's really just going to be that point and me talking about that point. So I'm reinforcing it. It's just the we get into trouble when we put up too much all at the same time. And you're
Yeah, because
basically
people
just
read
saying,
ahead.
yeah, and you're saying, listen, I'm not really telling you where what we want to do when we're presenting. And I've been thinking about this a lot just because it's so difficult to capture and keep people's attention. Right. There's so
Right.
many. I did it in the newsletter this week. It's like the competitor to your content is only a gaze away. Right. Oh, oh,
Right.
ooh. That's
There it
really
is.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna then just one thing leads. Oh, that reel was funny. I'm just gonna
Yeah.
go, and it's subtitled, so I can just maybe just sit back.
I can watch.
We
I
don't
can watch it while you're talking.
Yeah, we don't feel good about it, but we all do it, right? But one of the ways
See,
to
that's the problem. So I got to interrupt just for a second.
go ahead.
That's the problem with previewing. As soon as you preview, so if I give you the 4 bullet points I'm going to talk about,
Mhm.
as soon as I've done that, I've given your brain permission to go to a TikTok reel. Because now you don't fear missing out because you know what's coming. So you're like, oh, okay, I recognize these 3 things. Maybe I'll pay attention to the third one. The first 2, I'm not that interested in.
Right.
Now you're allowing your audience to like calculate whether or not they should pay attention
I'll
because
tune back in on
because
slide
you're
5.
yeah, exactly. I'll tune back in on I'll tune back in on point 4.
Yeah.
So not only are they not listening to you while they're reading ahead, they're also doing a mental calculation on whether or not they're going to listen to you while you go through this stuff. So I love I like the concept of animation. I don't love doing it in person because it pulls people away. So then I struggle with, okay, what do I do in person? And I do something a little different. I go through all the bullet points and then I show them. I don't even put them up there. So I'll be like, okay, there are 3 things we're going to talk about. I'll talk about the 3 things, and then I'll put them at the end as review. And then if I forget one, or if there are more than 3, or if there are 2 sets, if I forget something, I'll be like, oh yeah, I didn't talk about that one yet, did I? So instead of and I think about this as timing, right? What you were doing with the annotation is kind of just in time.
Mhm.
And you can go and you can also go a step further where instead of just in time, you show it after the fact.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then you become the leader of the presentation instead of PowerPoint being the leader of the presentation. Because usually what happens when people have visuals is now the visuals is the leader,
Yeah,
right?
it's a crutch a lot of times to be like, oh, I'm just gonna sort of it'll always be there, so I can just kind of look back and I can refer to it, but it creates this
And the
different dynamic,
audience
as
can
you're
look
saying.
forward.
Right, right,
Like,
and
why do we
decide.
want our audience to be able to look forward?
Yeah, the thing about attention and visuals is that we do want the audience to, what I like to say is, think along with us, right? Because we want them to be thinking about what we're doing. We don't want them to be thinking about the meeting that they have or that TikTok they need to see. By the way, just as a quick aside, like, you think that a short reel like is the epitome of the where we're going as far as attention and our lack thereof. But for anyone who's watched some of these reels recently, and even this happened with YouTube TV and in my house, is that these videos now are often split screen. So 2 different things are going on. So like there's one thing on the top, here my little guys, one thing
Yep.
here and one thing there. And they're different. They may be slightly related, maybe slightly related, but it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm bored at the top, so I'm going to look at the bottom, or then I'll tune back to the top. Even on YouTube TV, they just rolled out this functionality where you can do split screen. It's not picture in picture. It's like literally 2 equal screens next to each other. So the
So you
battle
can
for
watch.
attention
So you can
has
watch
never
2
been
things at the
greater,
same time.
which
Yeah.
of course you can't, right? You
Right.
can't, we can't, our brain can't
I mean, it's March
accommodate that.
Madness, right? So in the beginning, you could watch 4 at the same time.
Well, they have a commercial, so like, and
Right,
it's
the
like, or it's
commercial comes on,
halftime.
you watch
Yeah.
games, you
Yeah, that's one thing, but like two
yeah,
things like, happening. But I guess all to underscore the importance of paying attention the importance of paying attention to these things, because attention is such a scarce resource or energy source, or however you want to describe it. And once you lose someone's attention, it can be difficult to get it back. And so what do you do to try to capture and keep attention? Of course, visuals are part of that, because people interpret the visual in their head differently, which is good. It's personalized and customized, that they do it
right,
themselves.
right,
you know so it's just, that's one of sort of Indy and I want to encourage the use of visuals. And the question becomes, what's the best way to use visuals? And we're talking
yeah.
about that, and obviously want your input too.
Well, one of the things that I like to ask um, presenters, so researchers, as they're putting together a presentation, is with each slide, like, do I actually need this slide? So not, do I need this much information on this slide, but do I need it at all?
Mhm.
And I love Mark. Mark, you've talked about having blank slides, right?
Yeah.
Where you just you so the slide deck is not, it's not even there all the time, right? And we see this sometimes in TED Talks, right? Where it won't be slides, it'll be 4 or 5 visual, like it's a 15 or an 18-minute talk, it's 4 or 5 slides that the grand total of those slides is only 4 or 5 minutes of the presentation, and the rest of the time it's blank. And I think we don't think about this, right? We don't think about, do I need a slide at all here, or can I just go to a blank screen? Can I explain it with my hands? Can I have a prop, like you just picked up your phone and you were using it as a prop, right? Like you could do that if you were doing a presentation and we were building a visual. You could show the split screen of the TikTok video if you were doing this as like a keynote address, helping people
Right.
think about visuals.
Right.
Or you could just pick up your phone and you could punch in a TikTok video and you could hold it up to the audience and they could see the two screens. And now you have instead of having a PowerPoint, you now have the phone in your hand. And
Right.
it's a totally different experience for the audience,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's really, really important. And I would call it content diversity. And so
I
you say,
love that.
well,
I'm writing that down.
I didn't come up with that term, but I will tell you that it is so important. So, just like Annie was saying, I'm talking to you, and then all of a sudden, here's a phone. Or I'll just say, I did a keynote in September that used a lot of different content, because it's 45 minutes, right? So, yes, I'm going to move around because it's natural and I'm moving with intention. Fine. So I'm not standing behind a podium. The
Not
podium is not
standing
your
behind a
friend.
podium.
We've talked about that before. Um, I am, and so yes, I am showing text, and it's usually a line. One slide could be one line of text, right? It could be a saying or something. And I had done an interview with someone who the audience knows and respects. So I showed them that video. It wasn't that long, but I showed them a video. I had GIFs, in there as well. And I also did this thing where I tossed these like I incorporated the space shuttle for a variety of
Yeah.
reasons related to the audience. And so I go on Amazon. I'm like, I can buy these little plushy mini
Space shuttles.
space shuttles. And so I asked some questions at the beginning, or I show some data at the beginning, and then I ask them questions a couple of slides later where they have to recall what was on the slide with the data. And if they got it
Yeah.
right, I'm tossing these
You're
things.
tossing
Yeah,
a space shuttle.
exactly.
I
And
love it.
so this woman came up to me afterwards. And so I was very deliberate about content diversity, that
Right.
and you can be too. Anyone can be. It just you have to recognize the importance of it. Um, and so this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, I always look at my phone during these things. And I didn't look at my phone once. I didn't want to look at my phone once during your talk. And it was because of this, I believe it was because of this diversity of different things that were happening. What's going to happen next,
Yeah,
and so
there's
we
a
can
real
all do
magic.
those.
Yeah, there's a real magic to people not knowing what's going to happen next. And it's so counter to, especially I think researchers, like most of the researchers I work with are working in universities. And a lot of the best practices and accessibility now for universities and teaching is to actually be very explicit because it increases accessibility. So a lot of the best practices are very counter for teaching, are very counter to the things that I teach for presenting. And I get myself in trouble because people are like, oh no, we can't do that. And I'm like, yes, you can. You got to understand that this isn't a teaching space. This is a presenting space. Teaching space, the audience is in charge of the motivation. There and you're giving them a test at the end, right? That's a different space. Whereas the types of presentation spaces that we're talking about, if you don't increase the curiosity of your audience along the way, then they're going to disappear, right?
Right.
Like
The
David,
old person.
I love this comment David just made. Hi, David. How you doing? Good to see you.
You see, David.
Um, audience interaction, right? Like, how do you get audiences to interact? I love what you said earlier, Mark, when you said, you know, working alongside each other, thinking alongside each other,
Yeah.
right? Like, we can show a visual and we can talk about the visual, but to show a bunch of text and just have it be what we're gonna like, just have it be replication is like, why are you doing that?
Yeah, and I guess the thing on teaching, I would say, Andy, because you're making a really interesting point when you hear like, oh well, this is we can't do that because we're teachers, but you're a presenter, so somehow you have access to a much more interesting set of tools. I would kind of push back and I would say like, well, what's the object of the lessons, of the teaching, of the instruction? Okay, well, yeah, you have a test, but I say, well, maybe to remember the content, or maybe to remember the content, therefore you can take action later on where you can recall the content in a context and apply the content and do something with it, right? Positive. I think that probably is the goal of teaching
Yeah,
on some level, right? So, well, if so, it all starts with memory. If you don't remember what the content is,
right,
that's the end of the story. And
right.
so research has been shown that, okay, well, how can we help people remember? And research that I've looked at talks about, okay, well, narrative structure helps people remember. I think that we've discussed that a
Yeah,
number of times, and most people are
absolutely.
familiar with that. But it was very funny because a woman in my online class, she was talking about this, and she said, we probably have all had teachers, who are kind of sleepy, was the word she used, and and you don't remember. But then we have like her whole affect changed. Then
Right.
and this is a computational biologist, PhD, and it's really heavy, quant stuff she's doing, and she talks about this as why it's a challenge to communicate it. And then she says, but then we've all had teachers who they use memes, and she's like, those are the teachers you remember, and that's the material that you remember. So if you say, well, I just want to be
Associate the idea
clear,
with a visual, the recall for the idea goes up.
yeah, and say,
It's
well, I
like,
can't do that because I have to be clear. Okay. Yeah, but that doesn't really compute as a way. I think our mind works is that, okay, if the goal is that they learn it, meaning they remember it, meaning they apply it, then you have to use techniques like the ones that we're talking about. I
give
would
them give
suggest.
them visuals that trigger, versus fully explain, right? Like, how do we use powerful images
Yeah.
that trigger emotions? How do we use images that, I mean, I like to think that this image, right?
Mhm.
You have to think about it for a moment. Like,
Mhm.
what's actually going on here? And this is about having one language processor. You can't do both of these things at the same time. Literally, the noise, the language is not making it to your brain, and that serves both as a discussion and a reminder for later. Like, what was Andy's? Oh yeah, he had that image and the one language processor. That was interesting. Like, all
Yeah.
that stuff we're trying to. That's what we're trying to create, right?
Yeah, and you can explain, is you should, to the best of your ability, explain the details, right? If this is in a course, right, and
Right.
it's necessary. We're not kind of talking about the presentation part. We've talked about how do you compare details, but let's just talk about a lecture, like a university lecture. Explain it. And then, like you're saying, Edie, like, can you associate it with something, and can you distill it down to maybe a sentence or something that is memorable, maybe alliteration or an acronym or something like that. It's really funny because in this book that I keep talking about, because I'm just fascinated by it, it's Bill Burchard is the author, and it's coming out on April 4th. I had
I
him on the
can't wait
podcast.
till I can't wait till it comes out. You got
It's
me
called,
all
yeah,
fired up about
yeah,
it.
it's called Writing for Impact, and it's like
Yeah.
8 secrets on how to, like, fire up your readers' brains. And he talks about how the brain is really always on the lookout for learning new things. But actually, before I go to that, let me just finish the thought with the distill, right? And he was talking about, when he works with authors, because in addition to writing, he helps other people write books. And he says, like, okay, well, like, let's look at the material that you have. Let's try to make it clear. Okay. Let's try to make it shorter, like shorter sentences, because the brain
Yeah.
wants that. Right. And then he's like, and then he's like, also, is this, you may be an executive, or you may be someone whose specialty is microbiology, but can we take what you're talking about and make it applicable beyond just microbiologists or people who love science, because
Right.
we want to make it relatable, right? We've talked about it. You need to make things
Right.
relatable to a whole
Yeah.
thing. And the last thing he says, which relates to what I just said, is, can you basically take the entire book and distill the message to one sentence? So he said, I can do it in 3 words for my book, which is reward your reader, right? And that's the mindset that you should
Nice.
have, right? And
My
and
friend, I have a friend who does TED Talk training. He's like, it's got to be a tweet. It's got to be
yeah,
shorter than a tweet.
yeah, no one will
Like,
see it
what's
unless
the
you've got
what's
this.
the tweetable? What's the tweet about what you're talking about? For me, with this, it's compliment, don't compete.
Yeah,
Like, don't, and the emphasis is really like, the thing that people get wrong is their visuals compete. And if you just think about complement or supplement, stop competing. Stop competing. Because that's what people are doing all the time with their visuals. It's like 2 tracks, like, take your pick. No. No. I don't want you to pick. I want you to choose me. Right? I don't want you to choose the visuals. I'm the one here on the stage. If I wanted you to choose the visuals, I would have sent you a picture book.
right. So go a little deeper on that, Andy. Like, so as far as the sequencing that you recommend with the visual, the use of the visual, how do you see that? Like, you're conveying information. How does the presentation of the video fit in sequentially, would you say? Or the visual, I should say.
Um, I think it fits in purposefully. So, like, the visual I showed a moment ago, I actually show that and let people wrestle with it.
Hmm.
I ask people a question like, what do you see here?
Hmm.
And depending on how much time I have, I'll get audience responses. Like, we'll start to try and talk about it. Um, when I have words, I rarely ever show a word before I've said it. So that, and sometimes that's annotation and sometimes that's just delay. So I'm saying something before it appears. It's a little bit like, I've been doing a lot of whiteboard work. I think people are sick and tired of visuals. So when I'm working in person doing workshops, I just show up with markers and whiteboards. And then I send people slides afterwards.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
and what happens is the whole thing becomes organic. So instead of being pre-scripted, it's like, well, I don't know what order we're going. I know what we're going to cover, but I don't know what order we're going to do it in.
Yeah. I think that is really interesting, from a co-creation aspect.
Exactly.
Because people are more, it's the IKEA effect, right? I'm more attached to, I value something that I've had a hand in than I would if I just bought off the shelf. So I put the thing
Right.
together for my daughter. It was like this desk, felt really proud. Blood, sweat, and tears went into it. A few Allen wrenches thrown out the window and disgust. Um, but it's done. And maybe it's not to
Right.
the level, but she's only 4 years old. She doesn't really care. But then I could, versus like I could buy this thing from Fisher Price or whatever, and yeah, okay, but I don't value it as much. But I value the IKEA thing, because I made this, right? And so when you involve people, of course, from an attention standpoint, that's just wonderful, because they're part of this process now. They're in the process.
Yeah,
It's
and I
not
do I
receiving,
do
but
stuff that
recipients.
literally involves them. So I play like hangman games and they come up and write the letter. Or there'll be certain phrases that I want them to remember. Like we're
Mhm.
talking about content, I'll be like, less is more. And we'll get to that point where we're like, okay, so what have we been talking about? And either I'll say less is more, or someone in the audience will say less is more. And I'll just take the pen and throw it to them, the marker. They're like, go put it on the board. And there'll be a side of the board that's like key takeaways. And I tell you, afterwards, people come up with their phones and they take pictures of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like different people, different handwriting, different, and it's that co-creation,
Yeah.
right? It's not, people get really passive with PowerPoint. Like you kind of feel like what's coming next. You read
Yeah.
ahead and
Yeah.
then you can look at your TikTok video and kind of half in, half out of the presentation.
Yeah.
And whiteboards, that doesn't happen. And if you stay ahead, like if you are using PowerPoint but you stay ahead of the PowerPoint instead of behind the PowerPoint, that tends not to happen. Or if you look at something together and then you do want to put it up, like you put the illustration up or you put the graph up or you put the data up and then you work through it together.
Yeah.
You work
Yeah.
through the understanding of it. um, but it's purposeful, so it's not like we'll always delay or always have a blank slide or never use slides or never. It's so the same thing you were saying about content diversity, I would say about timing diversity.
Mhm.
Think about not only the slide, but when do I show it relative to when do I talk about it? Do I talk about it and then show it, or do I show it and then talk about it, or do I talk about it while we're looking at it? And all three of those, like just be conscious. Like make a strategic decision about each slide, because each slide your audience has a different relationship with.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And the thinking along with aspect is something that I really emphasize, because it is like what you were describing, Andy, with co-creation, but it's co-creation on a cognitive level without actually like writing the stuff. So,
Right.
it's triggering things in the audience's mind that are specially tailored for them because they're the ones who are imagining it. So the imagery that we're creating with a visual or with a story that's vivid, which is why specificity is so important, right? Talked about that because I need to give you elements to visualize in your
Right.
mind. Because the more you're doing that, and I want you doing it the entire time,
Then
be,
you're not on TikTok. You don't even think about looking at
you
your
don't you
phone
don't
because
you
you're
don't
already
think
doing something.
you've already got this. We all walk around with a screen in our heads anyway. So the
Right.
question is, what are, as a presenter, you want to be having the person actually creating their own content in their head that's derived from what you're talking about, what you're showing. And then, then you've got a 10 out of 10. They're
Yeah.
completely locked on and their attention is, completely with you and they're bought in, just like they are when they go to the board and write a takeaway,
Yeah.
So yeah,
And
really,
and
really
what
good.
happens? Yeah. What happens in those situations is even though the conversation is very one sided, it actually feels like a conversation
Mhm.
because it feels like you've been talking with each other or talking along. It feels like the presenter has been presenting alongside with you versus at you. And
Right.
and getting people to feel like we're with them instead of talking at them
Right.
makes all the
Yeah.
difference.
So true. I think those should be the closing words, Andy, as we hit the top of the hour.
We hit the top of the hour. We're going to call it a day. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. It wouldn't surprise me at all if 2 weeks we keep talking about visuals and have a few more things that we didn't even talk about things like how do we show data, but we could. So stay tuned, and we'll hopefully see everybody again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and if you're watching this in the recorded version, please go ahead and leave comments. We'll receive those. Go ahead and like the LinkedIn page when the Sounds of Science LinkedIn page, and you'll get notifications when we go live. But please feel free to leave your own observations. We want this to be a co-created product, so to speak. So please feel free to do that, and we'll reference it and incorporate it in future episodes.
Awesome. Cheers, everybody.
Take care,
See you again in
everybody.